The Dark Scrolls. Hey everyone! Tonight on The Dark Scrolls, we're descending into one of the darkest childhoods ever recorded in English noble history. A story not of queens or crowned heirs, but of a little girl whose life was carved open by treason, siege, imprisonment, and the machinery of royal punishment, long before she understood the meaning of rebellion. Before she learned to read, she learned to fear. Before she learned to write, she learned what a cell felt like. And before she could even walk steady, she was already married, written into a contract that treated her body as currency. Tonight, we explore the life of Elizabeth de Badlesmere, daughter of a baron executed for treason, a child prisoner in the Tower, a pawn traded between families, who nonetheless became the ancestral hinge upon which future royal bloodlines would turn. So, before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these deep dives into the shadows of medieval history. And I want to know something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? The Dark Scrolls reaches people at strange hours, in dim rooms, and I'm always fascinated by where these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that low, constant hum, and let's step together into the cold, windowless world where Elizabeth's story begins. A child sits on a cold stone bench in a windowless room, the kind of room designed not for pain, but for containment, which in many ways is far worse. Pain at least announces itself. Containment simply exists. It presses in from all sides, makes the air thin, makes the floor feel harder, makes silence feel heavier than the stone walls that hold it. Her knees are pulled to her chest beneath the thin folds of a dress that was never meant for winter, never meant for stone, never meant for a child who no longer understands whether it is day or night. Her fingers move along the mortar lines as though searching for something. Not escape. She does not yet believe escape is possible, but for some kind of pattern that could help her understand why she is here. Children search for meaning the way adults search for justice, endlessly, with diminishing hope. Beyond the wooden door, voices rise and fall in violent waves. Political voices, men who speak of loyalty and treason, men whose armor clatters as if arguments require the sound of metal to feel substantial. But none of that meaning reaches her. She hears noise, only noise. A distant argument in a language she does not yet understand. A world that does not translate itself to children. What reaches her instead is hunger. Not sharp hunger, but the steady, bureaucratic kind. The hunger created by measured rations, just enough to sustain a body, never enough to quiet its complaints. She learns quickly that hunger is not something the tower guards consider a problem. Hunger is part of the system. Hunger keeps prisoners compliant. She learns something else. Cruelty administered by paperwork does not feel like cruelty. It feels like rules. It feels like order. It feels like someone, somewhere, wrote her life into a ledger she will never see. She does not understand treason. She does not understand rebellion. She does not understand the politics that have wrapped around her like a snare. She understands only absence. Her father's absence. The silence where servants' footsteps used to be. The empty spaces in her memory that were once filled by sounds of comfort. A household, once bustling, has collapsed inward, like a structure stripped of beams. Servants dismissed, retainers arrested, horses confiscated, tapestries removed. A great house can be unmade faster than a child can learn to read. Her toys are gone. Not simply taken away, removed as if they never existed, as though the Crown believes play is a form of disloyalty. Letters arrive for her mother, but their seals are hard and their words harder. Latin and Anglo-Norman phrases about land seizures, forfeitures, punitive fines, debts that bloom like wounds, and retribution. Words shaped by adults whose hands never trembled while writing them. Somewhere in those letters, whispered between their lines, comes the phrase that will define her life: an arranged destiny. She does not yet understand what it means to be promised, to be positioned like a piece on a board, conceived by men whose lives extend far beyond hers. But she hears it often enough to know it is not about her wishes. This is punishment made domestic. Punishment structured by routine. Punishment that takes the form of a child waiting for a door to open or close. Now and then she hears her name, Elizabeth, spoken in the same tone someone might use for a cloak or a ledger or a parcel of land. She has already become something that can be transferred. From this small, windowless room, the shape of her life begins. Elizabeth de Badlesmere was born into a world where lineage mattered more than breadth. Her father, Bartholomew de Badlesmere, served as steward in the household of Edward II, a position close enough to royalty to provide opportunity, and close enough to royal conflict to guarantee danger. Her mother, Margaret de Clare, was of a powerful line, niece to an earl, trained to manage estates, retainers, servants, and the expectations of a noblewoman whose life was already mapped before she entered the world. Her birth was not recorded as a celebration, but as an asset, the arrival of a daughter whose future could bind alliances. From her first breath, her life was political currency. Her early education was practical: prayers, household order, letters, the reading of accounts. Everything designed to prepare her for the roles expected of noble daughters: wife, mother, manager of estates, facilitator of alliances. She did not know that her first marriage contract had already been discussed before she spoke her first full sentence. She was 3 years old when the contract was formalized. 3. The age at which most children learn to run without tripping, to speak in full thoughts, to cling to their mother's sleeve. At 3, Elizabeth was led, physically guided, into a chapel at Kinlet, Shropshire, where clerics recorded a marriage that she would only understand decades later. Her husband, Edmund Mortimer, was a boy between 10 and 15, still considered a child by the standards of the time, though old enough to recite vows. Their union was not consummated, of course. They were still children, but the legal weight fell on them immediately. Entailments, wardships, dower rights, claims to land and custody. A cascade of obligations neither could read, all overseen by adults who evaluated children the way merchants evaluate goods. Such arrangements were common, but commonality does not make them less chilling. Marriage was a strategy. Children were bargaining chips. And Elizabeth, like many noble daughters, became a unit of calculation long before she understood what numbers were. Her family gained protection by aligning with the Mortimers, one of the most ambitious families in England. Roger Mortimer, Edmund's father, was rising, gathering influence, and Elizabeth's tiny hand, held in ceremony, was one more thread, weaving the de Badlesmere line into Mortimer's growing political web. The records that mention this marriage are fragmentary. Citations in later genealogical rolls, references in legal disputes. But their existence affirms a reality. Elizabeth's body was a site of political intention long before she became aware of it. But political alliances are fragile, and the fragile often break under the weight of royal expectation. Her household stability began to fracture at Leeds Castle, where her mother, Margaret de Clare, made the fateful decision to refuse entry to Queen Isabella's retinue. Chroniclers recount this moment without emotion. A refusal, an exchange of violence, an escalation that moved faster than anyone expected. But beneath that brief line in a chronicle lies the destruction of a family. The Crown retaliated swiftly, brutally, bureaucratically. The siege of Leeds Castle was not a heroic stand, it was punishment. Bartholomew de Badlesmere aligned himself with rebellious peers opposing the king's favourites. In the volatile court of Edward II, this was a deadly miscalculation. Writs to seize property were issued almost immediately, orders to arrest, to confiscate, to imprison. Margaret and her children, including 8-year-old Elizabeth, were taken into custody. The records of their transfer into royal custody are chilling in their simplicity. Names listed, ages noted, guardians assigned, costs estimated. Lives reduced to numbers, signatures, and fiscal responsibility. The Tower of London, where Elizabeth was held, looms large in English imagination. But for her, it was not a place of spectacle. It was a place of administration. A place where children learn the power of silence. A place where seasons changed outside, but inside remained the same. Household rolls list the costs of her maintenance. Bread, ale, bedding, fuel. There are occasional notes on medical care, an indication that illness did not excuse one from custody. These unemotional documents are the closest thing to a diary she left behind. Her childhood became a ledger. Her father's execution, ordered and performed with official efficiency, turned her into the daughter of a traitor. The parliamentary rolls record his condemnation without sentiment. The writs that followed outline the forfeiture of every asset he possessed. And in the cold logic of monarchy, when a man falls, his family falls with him. Elizabeth's world collapsed long before she could understand what had destroyed it. Her childhood became a ledger. Every day inside the tower added another entry. Bread weighed to the ounce, rushes replaced at scheduled intervals, the cost of wool cloaks for winter tallied with quill scratches that echoed faintly in clerks' chambers. The machinery of imprisonment did not rely on whips or manacles, it relied on documentation. To be recorded was to be confined. Elizabeth's existence narrowed to the rhythms of administrators. Keys at dawn, silence at midday, footsteps at dusk. The tower did not crush her, it suspended her, like an object in formaldehyde, preserved but not living, waiting for decisions made far beyond her reach. Unknown to her, the political map of England was reshaping itself with seismic force, forces that would once again pull her life into movement. Outside the tower, the man whose son she had been married to at 3 years old was rewriting the fate of the kingdom. Roger Mortimer, Lord of Wigmore, escaped imprisonment in the Tower with a boldness that would become the foundation of legend. He fled to France, built an alliance with Queen Isabella, and began recruiting those disaffected by Edward II's rule. Chroniclers would later frame Mortimer's rise as ambition bordering on audacity, but the administrative record offers a different view. Patents of safe conduct, lists of supporters, movements of ships, and writs issued in response to his growing threat. As Mortimer's influence spread, the Crown's grip weakened, and with that weakening came the first threads of reversal for the de Badlesmere tragedy. When Mortimer and Isabella returned to England in 1326, their power was overwhelming. Edward II fled, retainers deserted, and political loyalty evaporated under the pressure of inevitability. Once the king was captured, the administrative machinery that had condemned Elizabeth's family began to reverse direction, like a tide pulled backward by a stronger force. In chancery rolls, writs appear restoring certain lands to families aligned with Mortimer. Pardons are issued, attainders reconsidered, fines reduced, and among the names appearing again, quietly, without commentary, is Elizabeth de Badlesmere. Nothing in the record suggests triumph. Restoration was not mercy, it was strategy. Mortimer needed loyal families, and the de Badlesmere inheritance, fractured though it was, still held value. Elizabeth, released from the Tower, entered the Mortimer household, not as a guest, but as a political presence. Her connection to the Mortimer line through marriage now positioned her more safely than at any moment since her father's execution. Her new world was filled with the sounds of authority, the clatter of retainers moving through hallways, the murmur of clerks preparing documents for Mortimer's seal, the rustle of tapestries in better rooms than she had ever known. Yet the comfort was thin. Power of this magnitude attracts watchers, some loyal, many waiting for a misstep. And Mortimer's ascent was steep enough to make his fall inevitable. Power in medieval England did not remain unchallenged long. Mortimer's dominance, exerted through Queen Isabella and the young Edward III, bred resentment across the nobility. Every appointment he made, every land he acquired, every privilege he exercised increased the volume of whispers. Those whispers grew into plans. On a cold night in October 1330, a group led by the young king infiltrated Nottingham Castle, the so-called tunnel coup. Chroniclers dramatize the moment: torches, steel, shouts, betrayal. But the bureaucratic record remains calm. Mortimer arrested, charges enumerated, execution ordered. The roll of Parliament lists his crimes in formulaic language. Adherent to enemies of the realm, purloiner of royal authority, corrupter of the Queen. To the administrative mind, narrative was irrelevant. Outcome was all that mattered, and the outcome was death. Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal. His body left to remind the realm of the consequences of overreaching ambition. With his death, his household fractured, patronage evaporated, allies fled. Every name associated with him became suspect. Elizabeth, still young, still married into the Mortimer line, found herself abruptly exposed. Her husband, Edmund Mortimer, survived his father's downfall only briefly. Records are unclear: illness, shock, political stress. But by early 1332, he was dead. A passing noted not in chronicles of emotion, but in inquisitions post-mortem that valued his holdings and transferred wardship of his heirs. Elizabeth stood now at the intersection of vulnerability and necessity. A widow with 2 young sons, heirs to a disgraced family, dependent on structures designed to benefit powerful men, not unprotected women. Her life entered its second phase of negotiation. In medieval law, widowhood was paradoxical. It erased a woman's political shield, her husband, but granted her limited autonomy over her dower lands and the right to negotiate remarriage. For Elizabeth, widowhood was not liberation, but it was leverage. Her sons, Roger, heir to the future Earl of March, and John Mortimer, became political commodities. Guardianship of noble minors was valuable. Whoever held wardship controlled lands, rents, and future marriages. Elizabeth had to act before others claimed her children's futures. The administrative record shows her in motion. Petitions filed, settlements arranged, custody disputes managed with precision that belies the peril beneath. She was not free. She was strategic. Her name appears in writs authorizing negotiations, in land confirmations that specify her rights, in financial accounts showing the portion of revenues designated for her support. These documents, though impersonal, reveal a truth. Elizabeth had learned how the machinery worked, and now she would use it. The solution she chose was a second marriage, not for affection, not for companionship, but for protection. In 1335, Elizabeth married William de Bohun, one of the most capable military commanders and political figures of Edward III's reign. He was loyal to the king, trusted in matters of war and diplomacy, and possessed the wealth and authority necessary to guard her son's inheritance. The match required a papal dispensation due to consanguinity between the Mortimer and Bohun lines. This dispensation survives in ecclesiastical registers, a single leaf of parchment authorizing a marriage that would reshape English genealogical history. The language is formal, the implication is profound. Through Bohun, Elizabeth stepped into a sphere of stability she had not known since childhood. Her household expanded, her influence grew, and the danger that had haunted her since the Tower years began slowly to dissipate. Her sons found security in Bohun's protection. Her own position rose with every military success he achieved, and through this union she became the mother of children who would inherit not only estates, but political relevance extending far beyond her own lifetime. Household accounts from these years, lists of retainers, expenditures on clothing, purchases of horses, arms distributed at her direction, capture a woman exercising authority with quiet confidence. It is during this period that Elizabeth transitions from a figure acted upon to a figure participating in the shaping of noble estate and legacy. Yet the administrative silence around her inner life remains impenetrable. What did she remember of the Tower? What did she feel when signing documents securing her son's futures? What shadows lived behind her decisions? History cannot answer. It can only follow the paper trail she left behind. The death of her brother, Giles de Badlesmere, in 1338 without heirs, elevated Elizabeth and her sisters into the role of co-heiresses. The Inquisition's post-mortem describing the partition of the Badlesmere lands are meticulous. Manor boundaries recorded, rents listed, obligations outlined. Elizabeth's portion, substantial, merged into the Bohun estate, increasing its wealth and political leverage. This expansion further secured the futures of all her children, Mortimer and Bohun alike. To the Crown, these records were routine. To Elizabeth, they were restitution, not of her father's life, but of the stability his fall had destroyed. Across writs, rolls, and royal confirmations, her name appears with increasing frequency, woven into transactions that shaped entire counties. Her influence is not narrative, it is administrative. It exists in lines of ink rather than lines of speech. By the 1340s and 1350s, Elizabeth had become a force within the structures that once crushed her. Noblewomen of her rank wielded power in forms overlooked by chroniclers. arranging marriages, managing estates, funding religious houses, influencing local governance through patronage. Her acts of patronage, grants to friars, gifts to chapels, alms to the poor, were not merely pious gestures. They were tools of reputation, memory, and alignment. The account rolls show her directing resources to institutions that would pray for her family, carry her legacy, preserve her presence beyond the grave. She understood something essential about medieval power, that survival was not an event, but a practice. Her influence deepened quietly as the decades moved, not with declarations or grand speeches, but with signatures, settlements, and the kinds of decisions that seem small in the moment, yet determine the shape of inheritance. The Bowen household, into which she had been absorbed through necessity and strategy, became a space where her authority spread along domestic lines that chroniclers rarely describe, but archival traces cannot ignore. Documents from these years show her presence in adjustments of land, in provisions for retainers, in the measured distribution of rents. Her name appears beside William de Bowen's in records that required joint consent, signalling not only her legal involvement, but her recognition as someone whose assent mattered. Her children with William extended the reach of her lineage. Humphrey, the son who would become a magnet of political gravity, inherited not only lands, but multiple historical trajectories converging through his mother. The Mortimer claim, the de Badlesmere inheritance, the Bowen authority. Each thread alone was weighty. Together, they created a lineage whose descendants would shape royal succession crises long after Elizabeth herself had been lowered into the ground. The daughter she bore, Elizabeth de Bowen, entered the Fitzalan family through marriage, creating yet another branch of influence that would intersect with the politics of the realm. In genealogical charts compiled centuries later, her name appears repeatedly as a hinge, small in print, vast in consequence. Through these years, Elizabeth's life reveals the complexity of noble womanhood as an administrative vocation. A lady of rank was expected to manage households that were political microcosms, retainers who owed military service, tenants who required arbitration, stewards who reported fluctuating incomes. She approved grants to religious houses, arranged marriages for younger kin whose prospects could strengthen or weaken familial standing, and managed the distribution of food, clothing, and payments within the estate. These traces show the silhouette of a woman whose work sustained political stability even as she lived under the memory of political collapse. Her will, drafted on May 31, 1356, is one of the few documents that speaks in her voice, although it preserves that voice through the formulaic diction of legal necessity. The will lists bequests with the clarity of a woman who had long learned that clarity is power. Gifts to servants who had remained loyal, provisions for religious houses whose prayers would secure her spiritual legacy, instructions for burial among the Black Friars in London, where the prestige of the location intertwined with the piety of the order. She chose her burial intentionally. The Black Friars were a place where the aristocracy anchored their memory, where stone and liturgy worked together to create continuity across generations. But the friary that once held her body would later be dissolved, its stones scattered, its tombs broken, its records dispersed. The physical site of her rest did not survive the transformations of later centuries, yet her presence endures in archives, lists of benefactors, notes on burial wishes, copies of wills preserved in ecclesiastical repositories. The loss of stone amplified the importance of parchment. History remembers her because administrators did. As the record continues, the significance of her children grows. Humphrey de Bowen became one of the most powerful men of his generation. His lands, titles, and marriages extended Elizabeth's influence outward in widening arcs. Through him, her bloodline entered the Lancastrian claim. Through her Mortimer sons, her lineage fed the Yorkist cause. In the 15th century, when dynasties tore each other apart, genealogists traced claims backward and found Elizabeth in multiple branches. The Wars of the Roses, with all their battles, betrayals, and reversals, were shaped by men who invoked ancestry that ran through her. That she was once a child prisoner in the Tower, once a girl married at 3, once a widow negotiating from the margins, does not contradict her later importance. It defines it. Her life demonstrates how medieval power worked, quietly, through contracts written decades before consequences emerged, relentlessly, through family lines that intersected on battlefields generations later. Even as her lineage expanded, the mechanisms of her era remained visible in the documentary residue she left behind. Wardship records, inquisitions post-mortem, property transfers, jointures, dowers. Each document reflects the world that shaped her and the world she shaped in return. These were not optional papers. They were instruments by which the state interacted with its subjects, mapping obligation, authority, and ownership. The presence of her name in these instruments testifies to her active participation in a system that had once reduced her to a cost in a ledger. But the silences in the archive are as revealing as the words. They remind us that emotional landscapes leave no trace in chancery rolls. They remind us that grief at 8 years old is not recorded under the column for expenses. They remind us that the trauma of imprisonment leaves no seal. They remind us that the quiet fear of a child presented at chapel to marry a stranger is preserved only in the knowledge that it happened, not in a record of how she felt. The archaeologist's shovel occasionally uncovers the physical shadows of her world. A tile patterned with heraldry, a chapel foundation at a site where she once stood, the remnants of friaries where prayers were once said for her soul. But these traces are faint. The paper trail remains stronger. It is through ink and vellum that her life becomes visible. Her story complicates modern assumptions about medieval women. She was certainly constrained, certainly controlled, certainly used as a political instrument. But she was also an administrator, a negotiator, a manager of estates, a mother whose arrangements shaped the fate of kingdoms. She did not choose the structure into which she was born, but she learned how to operate within it, how to navigate its obligations and turn them into forms of stability for her descendants. The administrative system that controlled her childhood became, in adulthood, a system she understood intimately. It operated through the immutable logic of property. Acres measured, rents collected, heirs named, inheritances confirmed. This logic had no concern for compassion. It cared only for continuity. Yet within this cold apparatus, Elizabeth carved paths for her children that allowed them to survive, and through survival, to influence the nation. Her life shows how history is built not only by kings and battles, but by the accumulation of decisions made in halls, in chapels, in the chambers of clerks. Her marriages, recorded in dry entries, became the threads from which dynastic conflict would eventually be woven. Her children, whose inheritances she protected with legal precision, would become actors in struggles far beyond her imagination. The consequences of her endurance outlived her by centuries. She died on June 8, 1356, at Rowhall in Essex, leaving behind a will that expressed the order she had imposed on the fragments of her life. The administrative returns following her death confirmed the execution of her final wishes. Her burial among the Black Friars fulfilled the last arrangement she could control. Yet even in death, her presence continued to shape records. The transfer of her dower lands, the confirmation of her children's rights, the disputes resolved by invoking her name. If her childhood was defined by the Crown's capacity to destroy her family, her adulthood was defined by her ability to navigate that same system with extraordinary resilience. She understood the terms of her world. Survival required alignment, negotiation, and the careful preservation of fragments from which stability could be rebuilt. Her life, viewed across the span of documents that record it, moves from vulnerability to influence, from confinement to authority, from obscurity to genealogical importance. It is fitting that she survives not in stone, but in ink. Ink was the instrument that imprisoned her, the instrument that restored her, and the instrument through which her legacy was transmitted. The state that nearly erased her childhood inadvertently ensured her immortality by recording every transaction that touched her life. Her descendants would inherit more than land. They would inherit a position in the story of England itself. And because of the administrative impulses of her age, the desire to record, to categorize, to document, Elizabeth de Badlesmere stands before us not as a ghost, but as a presence, visible in the archives that never meant to remember her. Her legacy did not diminish when she died. Instead, it expanded outward, in spirals that touched every corner of aristocratic power. After her burial at the Black Friars, the administrative aftermath of her passing began almost immediately. Clerks recorded the transfer of her dower lands, surveyed her holdings, and confirmed inheritances. These records appear unemotional, but each one reflects the conclusion of a life that had been shaped by the Crown's authority, and, in turn, had shaped the authority of those who followed her. The documents speak with quiet certainty. Elizabeth de Badlesmere had been a presence whose rights mattered enough to formalize, whose property required exact accounting, and whose lineage carried implications long after her body was interred. The value of her inheritance was not simply monetary. Land was the foundation of military service, social influence, and political leverage. To possess land was to command loyalty. To inherit land was to inherit obligation. Her children, both Mortimer and Bowen, stepped into these obligations with the advantages she had secured for them. Their ability to assert claims, to form alliances, and to maintain positions at court stemmed in part from Elizabeth's persistence through the upheavals of her youth. Her eldest Mortimer son, Roger, would eventually become the second Earl of March, restoring the Mortimer name to prominence. The Mortimer claim, strengthened through generations, would later intersect with the Plantagenet succession, creating one of the most potent genealogical arguments of the 15th century. Historians tracing the origins of the Wars of the Roses cannot avoid encountering Elizabeth's name as they map the roots of dynastic conflict. The Yorkist claim itself, invoked by Richard, Duke of York, and later by Edward IV, drew much of its legitimacy from the Mortimer descent, a line that passed directly through her. Her Bowen children carried a different legacy. Through Humphrey de Bohun, her lineage entered the bloodstream of the Lancastrian kings. Humphrey's daughter, Eleanor de Bohun, would become grandmother to Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV. When Henry IV seized the throne, he did so not only with the force of arms, but with genealogical arguments grounded partly in the Bowen inheritance that Elizabeth's life had helped stabilize. Thus, She stands at the intersection of Yorkist and Lancastrian lines, a silent fulcrum in the machinery that produced England's most destructive civil conflict. Yet none of this would have been visible to her. Her world, shaped by stone walls and political volatility, did not allow her to imagine the distant consequences of her marriages and negotiations. She learned early that survival depended on attention to the immediate, securing lands, arranging alliances, navigating the fragile loyalties of powerful men. But the administrative traces that survive, petitions, settlements, dispensations, reveal her work in building a foundation that others would stand on. This is the nature of medieval power. It accumulates in layers, often through decisions that appear mundane in their moment. A marriage arranged in childhood becomes the root of a royal claim a century later. A dower settlement ensures the stability of an estate that will fuel armies long after the original signatories have turned to dust. A widow's petition for her son's rights fortifies genealogical lines used to justify future rebellion. History often unfolds in the shadows of such paperwork. Still, the archive is incomplete. It preserves the skeleton of events, but not the flesh of experience. No document tells us how Elizabeth remembered the tower, or whether she dreamed of the cold stone that once pressed against her back. No petition reveals her tone, her manner, the cadence of her voice. No will discloses what she feared most, or what memories stayed with her longest. Her life, like the lives of thousands of medieval women, survives only in traces shaped by the state. But these traces are not impartial. They reflect the priorities of those who created them. The Crown recorded her when she mattered, when she was property, when she held land, when she bore heirs. Her childhood trauma left no mark on the parchment. Her personal bonds with servants or kin are erased, except where compensation appears as a line in an account. Emotion is not a category of medieval administration. As a result, the Elizabeth who emerges from the record is precise but incomplete, visible but silent. And yet, interpretation finds room within these silences. The gaps are not empty, they are charged with implication. Every missing detail invites reconstruction, not through invention, but through contextual understanding. The conditions of her imprisonment are known. The expectations placed on noble daughters are documented. The rhythms of household life, the pressures of alliance-making, the burdens of estate management, all these contextual elements allow historians to imagine the contours of her experience with reasonable fidelity. Her life is not preserved in her own words, but it can be reassembled from the structures that constrained and enabled her. Her marriages, for instance, reveal the political logic of the age. The first, contracted when she was 3, was an early lesson in the commodification of childhood. The second, arranged as a widow, demonstrates her ability to navigate male-dominated structures. The papal dispensation, permitting her union with William de Bohun, is itself a testament to her significance. Dispensations were neither cheap nor casually granted. Each act of approval speaks to networks of influence, obligations, and negotiations that intersected through her. Similarly, her imprisonment reveals the Crown's capacity for coercion. Noble children were frequently held as leverage, their confinement dependent not on personal guilt, but on their father's political decisions. Elizabeth's presence in the Tower was a message directed not at her, but at those who had opposed the king. Her body communicated what words could not. Defiance would be punished, not only through death, but through the systematic dismantling of families. Her release, conversely, reflects the Crown's shifting priorities. Political realignments redefine guilt and loyalty. What is treason one year becomes service the next. The restoration of her status under Mortimer's ascendancy illustrates the ephemeral nature of medieval justice. No ideological transformation occurred, only the balance of power changed, and Elizabeth moved accordingly. Her re-emergence into noble life after the Tower must have been a shock in ways the record cannot express. After years of constrained movement, she entered halls filled with servants, banners, conversations, and ritual. But the habits she learned in captivity, silence, observation, caution, may have equipped her for the complexities of Mortimer's household better than any formal education could. Power expresses itself differently when witnessed from below. Elizabeth had seen its cruelty firsthand before she ever saw its ornamental facade. As she grew into adulthood, the administrative world that had once dominated her existence became a tool she wielded. Whether negotiating dower lands, confirming wardships, or directing patronage, she acted within the system that had imprisoned her, turning its mechanisms toward stability rather than punishment. Her story is not one of rebellion, it is one of adaptation, a form of resilience that operates quietly beneath the notice of chroniclers but shapes the fabric of noble continuity. Her will, with its calm directives, reveals the culmination of this adaptation. She orchestrated her final arrangements as one who had long understood that clarity is a shield against misinterpretation. The specificity of her bequests, the deliberate naming of beneficiaries, the request for burial at the Black Friars, all reflect a mind trained by experience to leave as little to chance as possible. In a world governed by paperwork, the will was her final assertion of agency. Her death is recorded without flourish. The date, June 8, 1356. The location, Roe Hall in Essex. The execution of her will followed the expected procedures. Administrators carried out her requests. Estates were reassigned. Her children continued their trajectories. And the world moved on, as it always does in the administrative record. But the consequences of her life continued to echo. Through the Mortimer line, her descendants challenged the stability of royal succession. Through the Bohun line, they gained the throne. Through intermarriages with other noble houses, her influence radiated outward in ever-expanding genealogical webs. Her name appears across heraldic visitations, pedigree rolls, parliamentary petitions, succession arguments, and chronicles of conflict. These mentions are small, often a single line, but each line is a reminder that her existence shaped political outcomes she never lived to see. The state that tried to erase her childhood preserved her adulthood. The archive held what the stone walls of the Tower never could. Her life, once constrained to a cold chamber and a thin dress, now spreads across centuries of historical memory, not because she sought prominence, but because the machinery of power found her impossible to ignore. Her story is one of structural violence and structural endurance. It demonstrates how political power operates not only through dramatic events, but through the slow accumulation of documented moments, a marriage here, a confiscation there, a petition filed, a writ approved, a will executed. These steps form a chain linking personal experience to national consequence. In the end, Elizabeth stands as a testament to the paradox of medieval record-keeping. The archive forgets emotion, but preserves impact. It forgets voices, but remembers names. It forgets childhood, but remembers lineage. And through that lineage, she becomes more than the sum of the documents that record her life. She becomes a force moving silently beneath the events that later chroniclers immortalized. She did not choose the world into which she was born, but she learned to navigate it with a precision born of necessity. And in doing so, she shaped the destinies of those who came after her. Kings, rebels, heirs, and chroniclers alike, leaving behind not a monument, but a record. Her life, when examined through the fractured lens of administrative survival, becomes a meditation on the limits of agency in a world where systems were older and stronger than the people caught inside them. Elizabeth lived in a century where politics operated like weather, vast, impersonal, destructive, indifferent to the bodies it swept across. Some were flattened, others lifted, most simply endured. She belonged to the last category, though endurance in her time was not passive. It was a discipline, a kind of relentless attention to the shifting weight of obligation. The more closely one reads the record, the clearer it becomes that her endurance was not a single event, but a series of recalibrations. After the Tower, after her father's execution, after Mortimer's fall, after widowhood, after remarriage, she developed a capacity for navigating the uncertainties that defined aristocratic life. She learned to read instability the way sailors read wind patterns, not as a threat to lament, but as a force to calculate. Each petition she filed, each property dispute she participated in, each settlement she negotiated, reveals a woman who understood that the administrative realm was both battlefield and sanctuary. It is tempting to imagine that her experiences hardened her, but the archive does not show hardness. It shows precision. It shows restraint. It shows the quiet consolidation of spaces where she could exert influence without drawing the attention that had once destroyed her family. Noblewomen learned early that conspicuous power invited retaliation. Subtle power, executed through domestic, legal, and spiritual channels, endured. Her patronage of religious institutions illustrates this subtle form of influence. Donations to friaries were not merely acts of piety, they shaped moral and social alliances. Monks prayed for the families who funded them, creating spiritual bonds that paralleled political ones. Masses, said in Elizabeth's name, would echo through generations, long after her physical burial site disappeared. Even in death, religious patronage ensured a form of visibility within the community, less tangible than stone, but more durable in its transmission of memory. Property transactions reveal another layer of her strategy. The Bohun estates were extensive, stretching across multiple counties, each requiring oversight that involved dozens of administrators, stewards, reeves, and clerks. Elizabeth's hand appears in these matters not through dramatic interventions, but through consistent approval and participation. This pattern suggests a woman deeply involved in the mechanics of estate governance. In a world where land was the currency of power, the ability to manage it effectively was not merely domestic labor, it was political literacy. Her negotiations regarding her Mortimer sons were particularly telling. Wardship was a profitable institution, often exploited by men seeking control of wealthy minors. Yet Elizabeth managed to retain significant influence over her sons' futures, ensuring they remained connected to both sides of their inheritance. In doing so, she preserved the Mortimer name despite the Crown's earlier attempt to extinguish it, and sustained the Bohun inheritance that would run through her second set of children. Few noblewomen succeeded so fully in navigating both sets of obligations. Even the silences in the record highlight her skill. The absence of accusations, disputes, or scandals involving Elizabeth suggests she understood the danger of drawing attention. Medieval courts were filled with noblewomen whose names surfaced only during conflict. Elizabeth's name, however, surfaces mostly in the context of order, transactions, approvals, wills, settlements. This absence of turmoil is itself evidence of competence. She had learned young how quickly stability could vanish. Yet beneath the surface of administrative clarity lies the shadow of her earliest years. The Tower never appears again in her adult record, but the memory of it would have marked her life with a quiet relentlessness. The sound of keys turning, the cold stone beneath her feet, the measured rationing of existence, these become formative experiences, shaping her understanding of authority. She grew into a woman who never confused privilege with permanence. The record shows a life lived with vigilance. The political context around her continued to shift long after her childhood traumas faded from immediate memory. Edward III's reign, marked by military ambition and territorial expansion, created opportunities for her husband, William de Bohun, whose successes on the battlefield further elevated their family. Each elevation carried administrative implications. Newly acquired lands needed management, honors required legal confirmations, and increasing wealth meant more elaborate arrangements for inheritance. Elizabeth moved through these developments with apparent ease, her presence threaded through the documents that formalized each change. In this environment, the relationship between gender and power becomes visible in stark terms. Women like Elizabeth could not lead armies, negotiate treaties, or sit in parliament. Their authority was exercised through other means, through household economies, through marriages arranged with strategic foresight, through loyalty networks built across years of careful patronage. This is not lesser power, it is parallel power, functioning through structures that required more subtlety than the overt displays available to men. When considering her long-term influence, it is impossible to ignore the genealogical pathways that run through her. Genealogy was not merely a record of descent, it was a political tool. Claims to land, titles, and eventually crowns relied on ancestry. Elizabeth's bloodline, dispersed through the Mortimer, Fitzalan, and Bohun descendants, became a reservoir of legitimacy for factions that would one day contest the throne. The fact that both Yorkist and Lancastrian claims could trace descent through her underscores her central position in the web of medieval power. The conflicts of the 15th century, 70 years after her death, were shaped by men whose right to rule depended partly on her existence. Her name appears quietly in pedigree rolls used to argue claims. Chroniclers of that later era rarely mention her directly, but the documents they cite demonstrate her importance as an ancestral figure. A girl once held prisoner, a girl once nearly erased by the crown, became indispensable to the royal narratives that followed. Her story, then, reveals the paradox of medieval documentation. The archive preserves what administrators valued, not what subjects felt. It tells us which lands she held, but not how she walked through those lands. It records the men she married, but not whether she feared them, admired them, or simply tolerated them. It preserves her will, but not the thoughts that shaped it. And yet, by reading the record carefully, one can sense her presence in the margins, in the decisions made, in the stability maintained, in the alliances preserved. The tower is never named in her adult decisions, but its shadow is there. The memory of confinement likely sharpened her understanding of risk. It may have taught her to measure words carefully, to assess threats before they emerged, to secure advantages quietly. Silence, once imposed upon her, became a method of survival. The archive, filled with the noise of other people's assertions, preserves her primarily through quiet acts. Her death did not conclude her influence. Instead, her legacy unfolded through the generations that followed, reaching into conflicts she could not foresee. The administration of her estate extended beyond her burial. Writs confirming her children's rights, adjustments to inheritances prompted by the deaths of relatives, and the continued functioning of the institutions she patronized All these events kept her name active in the bureaucratic memory of the realm. What remains most striking about her life is its combination of fragility and force. She was vulnerable because of her gender, her youth, and the politics of her father. She was powerful because she endured, because she navigated structures designed to limit her, and because she transmitted to her descendants the legal and political capital necessary for their future prominence. The crown tried to reduce her to a liability, but she became an asset to some of the most influential families in England. Her story is not extraordinary because of dramatic choices or defiant speeches. It is extraordinary because it reveals how history often moves. Not through heroism, but through survival. Not through declarations, but through signatures. Not through force, but through continuity. She did not seek to shape the fate of kingdoms, yet kingdoms were shaped partly through her. The further one travels from her lifetime, the more her presence becomes conceptual rather than personal. Chroniclers of later centuries refer to her only in relation to the famous figures descended from her. Antiquarians list her in genealogies as a link in a chain rather than as a person. Even historians studying her era often encounter her as a footnote to baronial rebellion or the Mortimer ascendancy. Yet when one examines the primary documents closely, she emerges not as an afterthought, but as a thread binding disparate elements together. Her life illuminates the machinery of medieval power from the inside. It shows how the crown policed loyalty through imprisonment and property seizure, how noble families secured their futures through alliances forged in infancy, how women navigated spaces where direct authority was denied to them, and how genealogical connections could become political detonators centuries later. Elizabeth lived all of this not as abstraction, but as the fabric of her daily existence. Her final legacy, preserved in deeds and pedigrees, is a testament to the endurance of the very systems that governed her. The medieval state relied on documentation to exert control. Ironically, that same documentation ensured that Elizabeth de Badlesmere, who entered the historical record as a political liability, emerged as a figure of enduring consequence. The archive that once confined her has, in the long sweep of time, liberated her story. Her presence in the centuries that followed became increasingly spectral, not because she vanished from record, but because she appeared only where the administrative hand required her. She was there in pedigrees drafted by heralds who sought to clarify lines of descent. She was there in writs, affirming the transmission of lands through maternal inheritance. She was there in disputes where rival branches of noble families invoked her as an anchor for their claims. She was there, always there, but never as a voice, always as a fact. It is possible to imagine her unaware that she had become a reference point for future generations. A woman whose existence would be used to settle questions she never heard, justify arguments she never witnessed, and resolve conflicts she could not have conceived. Genealogy made her a constant presence, even as memory reduced her to a thin line of ink. The paradox of medieval history is that influence does not require awareness. A person can shape the world profoundly without knowing the extent of their impact. Elizabeth lived in the confined lanes of her own time. History placed her in a vastly wider landscape. Her importance to the great succession struggles of the 15th century is one of those ironies that history preserves with unnerving clarity. The Mortimer descent through her eldest son helped legitimize Yorkist claims, providing the genealogical ammunition that Richard, Duke of York, and later Edward IV, would wield when challenging Lancastrian rule. The Bohun descent through her daughter contributed to the Lancastrian inheritance itself, meaning that the claims of both contending houses, York and Lancaster, ran back through the same woman. That a child who once sat hungry and confused on a cold stone bench in the Tower of London would someday be invoked by kings and rebels seeking to justify the right to rule is a reminder that political significance often grows in soil watered by suffering. Across the 15th century, her name surfaced whenever legal minds traced the tangled branches of noble lineage. These pedigrees, drafted with extreme care, reveal the Crown's reliance on genealogy as a political instrument. They also reveal the persistent presence of women in the transmission of power, even when chroniclers ignored them. Elizabeth appears not because she wrote or commanded or conquered, but because she endured, married, bore children, and ensured their survival. In the logic of monarchy, these acts went further than any single speech or battle could. But reducing her to a genealogical function obscures the complexity of her lived experience. She was more than a link in a chain. She was a witness to the instability of her age. She experienced firsthand the violent consequences of political conflict. She saw titles stripped, lands seized, households dismantled. She experienced imprisonment as a child and widowhood as a young woman. She negotiated survival through systems designed by and for men. She learned to see power not as an abstract ideology, but as the cold hand that opened or closed doors. Her life was shaped by the Crown's decisions, and yet she maneuvered within those constraints to shape the future of her descendants. Somewhere within the unrecorded spaces of her life, there must have been moments when she remembered the Tower, not as a historical fact, but as a sensation. The weight of the air, the roughness of stone, the sound of guards moving beyond her door. That memory, carried silently through her adulthood, may have sharpened her awareness of vulnerability. It may have taught her to avoid drawing the kind of attention that had ruined her father. It may have informed her decisions regarding her sons and their inheritances. Yet the archive does not and cannot confirm this. It is left to inference, the historian's careful reading of silence. Her adult life, though materially secure, would never have been free from the awareness that instability could return. Nobility in the 14th century lived under the shadow of fluctuating royal favour. A patron's fall often meant the collapse of entire networks. Elizabeth had experienced this twice, first through her father, then through her father-in-law. Such memories do not fade. They instruct, they warn, they carve habits that last a lifetime. And so her actions, as preserved in documents, reflect a woman who maintained stability with meticulous care. She authorized grants that strengthened bonds with religious institutions. She approved settlements that prevented internal disputes from fracturing estates. She supported marriages that extended her family's alliances. Each act, viewed separately, appears ordinary. Together, they reveal the strategy of someone who understood that life at the upper levels of society required the constant reinforcement of one's position. Nothing was permanent unless vigilantly maintained. Even her burial request reflects this awareness. To choose the Black Friars was to situate herself among a community whose prayers and prestige would uphold her memory. Burial was not simply about rest, it was a declaration of belonging. It linked her to an order whose intellectual presence and civic role ensured that, even if the world changed, her name would remain associated with a place of authority. The dissolution of the monasteries eroded that space, but the documentary record preserved her intent. Her will, one of the most personal documents she left, is a map of the world she lived in. It lists possessions, not as sentimental items, but as assets to be distributed according to need and obligation. It names beneficiaries, not in the language of affection, but in the language of duty. It reveals a mind organized by the logic of her time, shaped by years of exposure to legal and administrative structures. Yet, in the quiet thoroughness of the document, there is a trace of personality, a sense of order, of responsibility, of clarity. She understood the significance of specifying each detail. She knew that ambiguity was dangerous. After her death, her presence continued in the functioning of the institutions she supported. Estates she once controlled continued to generate income. Lands she helped secure remained tied to her descendants' fortunes. Disputes resolved by reference to her will became part of the larger jurisprudence of the realm. In this way, her role extended across generations, shaping decisions she never witnessed. Her life's arc, beginning with enforced political participation as a child, moving through captivity, loss, alliance building, estate management, and eventual genealogical significance, illustrates the cyclical nature of medieval power. It punishes, it restores, it punishes again. It makes instruments of its subjects and then honors them for fulfilling roles they did not choose. Elizabeth's story is neither triumph nor tragedy. It is structure. It shows how individuals move within systems that do not consult them. It shows how survival becomes influence when viewed across centuries. It shows how the private suffering of one woman can ripple into the public conflicts of a nation long after her voice has faded. Historical narratives often privilege those who act visibly in the public sphere: kings, generals, chroniclers. But the administrative record reveals a different truth. Power is transmitted through marriages arranged in quiet chapels, through decisions made in household chambers, through inheritances divided according to law, through alliances formed not on battlefields, but in the daily maintenance of estates. Elizabeth lived within this world and shaped it through every step she took to preserve her family's standing. The silence surrounding her is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of the gendered nature of historical memory. Medieval women rarely appear in chronicles unless scandal or saintliness elevates them. But the archive, with its impartial appetite for documentation, preserves their movements in ways chroniclers ignored. Elizabeth's life, reconstructed through this documentary lens, becomes a reminder that history is expanded by those who endured within the spaces others overlooked. As the centuries advanced, her name remained a steady presence in the genealogical arguments of noble families. Those who traced claims to land or precedence often cited her. The fact that both Yorkists and Lancastrians invoked descent through her shows that the Crown's attempt to erase her family's influence ultimately failed. The state that once imprisoned her ended up relying on her lineage to justify its future rulers. This, too, is part of the paradox she embodies. Her story ends not in dramatic revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of significance. She leaves history not with a proclamation, but with a trail of documents whose meanings grew far beyond their original purpose. She becomes a figure whose influence is both pervasive and understated. A presence known through the legal and genealogical scaffolding that shaped medieval and early modern England. In the end, she stands as the exemplar of a particular kind of historical force. Silent, structural, enduring. Her life demonstrates how power can operate through those who appear powerless, how influence can be exercised through compliance as much as resistance, and how the systems that constrain individuals can unintentionally amplify them through time. Her name, once written into records that sought only to categorize and control, now serves as a portal to understanding the intricate workings of a world where private suffering became public consequence, where childhood fear became dynastic foundation, and where the life of a single woman, shaped by confinement and calculation, became part of the architecture of a kingdom. If you found this deep dive compelling, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The Dark Scrolls reaches far beyond these words, and I'm always fascinated to see how these forgotten lives travel across time and night. Until next time, this has been The Dark Scrolls, where we unseal what history tried to bury. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.